Okay. So my first article is Police Perspectives on Responding to Mentally Ill People in Crisis, Perceptions of Program Effectiveness. So in this study, a sample was conducted based on 3 police departments. These 3 departments were chosen due to the fact that each department had a different response program to mentally ill individuals. Police officers are known to be the first line of response for crises that involve mentally ill individuals. Since the police are the first responders in this case, they are the #1 referral source for psychiatric emergency departments. Statistics show that police referrals take up to a third of all mental health referrals. As referrals are often, this isn't always the case. Data from mental health consumers show that individuals who struggle with mental health will be arrested at least once in their life. So referrals aren't really the actual outcome to all cases. There are 3 specific methods and police departments that the departments usually conform to at least one of them. So the first is police-based specialized police response. The second is police-based specialized mental health response. And then the last one is mental health-based specialized mental health response. So 3 police departments were chosen to represent one of the 3 response models: Birmingham, Alabama, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Memphis, Tennessee. The selection process of these 3 departments occurred through a mailed survey that was inquiring townified departments to show how they handled mental health crises. So first, a survey was sent out, then a follow-up meeting was held. Then, once the 3 cities were selected, a more detailed case study was conducted. So to start, Birmingham represented the police-based specialized police response. So their police department hired an in-house mental health employees to handle those calls. Knoxville represented mental health-based specialized mental health response. So their department had their own mobile mental health unit working for the department. And then lastly, Memphis represented police-based specialized mental health response. So they had their own sworn-in officers specially trained to be able to handle these crises. So this survey was conducted to measure officers' perceptions and the department's effectiveness. Officers' perceptions about handling mental health illnesses incidents, officer perception of local mental health systems, and effectiveness of the department's response were all measured with a Likert scale. The survey was given out at police departments at the start of every roll call for a 24-hour shift. The final sample size for all 3 departments was 452 respondents for the survey. The Birmingham Police Department had 190 respondents, Memphis had 207, and Knoxville had 55. So some results just from the survey was that of these 452 officers, 89% of them were male. Knoxville had the highest representatives of male with a 93%, and also had the youngest individuals who took the survey ranging at age 30. And so the average mean age of all of the departments was 32-year-olds. So as 7% of the responses came from a sergeant rank or higher, the majority of responses came from patrol officers in the department. Majority of respondents were white and non-Hispanic and had been on the job for an average about 6 years. Monthly mental health crises cases were averaged out. So Birmingham had 4 cases, Knoxville had 7, and Memphis had 9 cases on average a month. So some results from officer perception. So officers were to rate their perception on how much of a problem mental health cases presented for their department. The result from this it didn't differ too much between the 3 departments. So like about half of each department thought it was a significant problem that their department had to face. Then there were And then the officers were asked how prepared they felt while handling a mental health crisis. So Birmingham's majority felt that they were well prepared. Knoxville's department had stated that over 3/4 of them felt well prepared. And Memphis stated that 100% of them felt well prepared within their CIT, with their CIT officers, which makes sense because it's their crisis intervention team. But then we also got statistics on their non-CIT team, which felt just over 60% well prepared to handle these crises. As it seems like everyone felt well prepared, officers in every department did not think that their fellow officers were well prepared to handle mental health crises, which is kind of funny. Lastly, officers were asked if they think their mental health resources were helpful to their department, like mental health systems or emergency room. So Knoxville said that theirs was not helpful. Their rating was only 15% of them thought that it was helpful. Memphis's CIT officers thought it was 69% helpful, and then their non-CIT officers thought it was 40% helpful. And then the Birmingham officers were around 50%. So next we go in to talk about perceived effectiveness. There were 4 factors looked at when seeing if officers thought that what they were doing was effective. The first being if they believe that they met the needs of individuals struggling with mental health in a crisis. So Memphis had a high rate of 74% of what they thought they were doing was effective. Knoxville reported 52% of their officers thought their program was effective, and then Birmingham thought 40% of what they were doing was effective. The second factor is whether the program is keeping the individuals who struggle with mental health and keeping them out of jail. So Memphis recorded 70%, Birmingham reported 47%, and Knoxville reported 41%. The third factor is whether their response program is minimizing the amount of time officers are spending taking these calls. Knoxville was only 7%, Memphis was 53%, and Birmingham was 20%. So this means that people with mental health illnesses are taking up a lot of the time of the police officers on the job. And then the last factor of effectiveness is that if it's keeping the community safe. Knoxville and Birmingham both rated that their response programs are effective to keeping the community safe. And then Memphis CIT officers rated that 94%, and non-CIT officers rated 68%. So the group that results show that was most prepared to handle situations of mental health was the CIT officers in Memphis. This suggests that specialized training and preparation for officers can better equip an officer for responding to a mental health crisis and just make it easier. It also talks about how a one-stop drop-off could be helpful for an officer and how it can save time for officers and then possibly reduce arrest as well. So some limitations was that it did not include a comparison police department that had no response program whatsoever. The results found could be from other factors, like departments could have more funding compared to others. And then there needs to be more psychiatric drop-off centers, the one-stop drop-off. This would minimize the workload for the officer and then possibly reduce arrest rates. So that was the first one. So the second article is Law Enforcement Response to Frequent Flyers, an examination of high-frequency contacts between police and justice-involved persons with mental illness. So this article looks at individuals with mental health disorders and how frequently they're coming into contact with law enforcement. For individuals who struggle with mental health and have various run-ins with the police, these are noted as frequent flyers. Before this study, there was little to none, just little research done on frequent flyers to determine the nature or size of the identified group. This study determined if an individual was a frequent flyer by the time between the contact with the police due to their mental health. So, some prior research showed that 16% of jail and prison populations in the United States is represented by people with mental illnesses. This representation of this group in jail and prison can affect funding, deinstitutionalization, and affect consequences of war on drugs. So police become a street corner psychiatrist when they are first responders to the call involved with people with mental illness. Once the police arrive, they have 3 different options on how they want to respond to the call. They can either perform a formal arrest, they can detain the individual from bring them into a mental health facility for evaluation, or they can resolve the situation informally right then and there. When police respond to these types of calls, it was noted from an officer's perspective that these calls are frustrating, time-consuming, and potentially violent. People with mental health illnesses are at higher risk of injury or death due to not complying with police commands, and this can turn into a perceived threat to the officer. So some about frequent flyers is that this study focuses on frequent flyers. These are individuals who have frequent or repetitive contact with law enforcement due to mental health illnesses. It has been noted that these type of individuals have a cycle of bouncing between jail, halfway houses, the streets, hospitals, back to jail. So one example from prior research on frequent flyers comes from Texas in 2009. So over a 6-year study, 9 frequent flyers were looked at, and they made 2,678 trips to the emergency room, which cost the government more than $3 million. So 8 of the 9 were abused substances, 7 struggled with mental health, and 3 were experiencing homelessness. So just that shows how much frequent flyers come into contact with certain type of resources. So the present study looks at how to identify the amount of frequent flyers by calculating the time they spend away from law enforcement. So once frequent flyers are identified, an analysis is done and documented. And so this took place in Benton County, Oregon. Law enforcement realized that this was starting to be an issue in Oregon and wanted research to be conducted on it, so they reached out to Oregon State University. In Benton County, officers can either arrest the individual, solve it informally, or perform a peace officer custody. So a peace officer custody is when the officer arrests the individual and brings them to a mental health facility because the officer believed that they were either a harm to themselves or other people. So 2 sets of data were looked at in this study: arrest rate and then the rate of informal resolvement. This data was collected over a 6-year period of time from January 2007 to the end of December in 2012. From the arrest data, there were 13,650 unique suspects, 22,875 arrests, and 33,064 charges given out within these 6 years. So taken from this data, there was a subset of individuals who were perceived to have mental health illnesses. So the data shows that through 697 individuals, there was 914 peace officer custody arrests, like clearly showing that there is repeat arrests. For informal contacts made by the police, there were 2 criteria to determine if the scenario involved a person with mental health illnesses. So the first is if the responding officer used a code of mental or 1260 in their incident report. And then the other way to identify is if the 911 dispatcher flagged mental when they are receiving the call. This is the dispatcher using their training to determine through the call if they think the individual is suffering from mental health illnesses. So within the 6-year span, there were 1,388 informally resolved police encounters. So just some results from informally resolved contact with people with mental illnesses. So from 2007 to 2010, it was pretty stable. There was about 200 resolved cases a year. And then in 2011, there was a 50% increase, which made it over 300 that year. And then in 2012, there was a decrease, but it didn't go under 200 cases resolved a year. So then some results from formal resolved contact with people with mental illness is 2007 to 2011, it was stable. There was arrests happening. And then 2012, it increased from 144 arrests to 245 arrests. So the rise from 2011 to 2012 shows that peace officer custody arrests were increasing faster than non-peace officer custody arrests. The increase of both peace officer custody arrests and informal resolutions translate to the amount of hours a police officer spends with these interactions. So 2017 to 2011, there was a stable amount of time spent with these interactions, but then in 2012, there was an increase, spending nearly 500 hours responding to these calls. That's twice the rate that was recorded in 2007. So over the 6 years, 697 individuals received one peace officer custody arrest, and then 117 of those received multiple. So based on the 117, there was a total of 334 peace officer custody arrests, meaning per person there was an average of 2.8 peace officer custody arrests over the 6 years. From this, of frequent flyers, there were 56 frequent flyers of the 117 that had a second peace officer custody arrest within 14 days of their first one. So to analyze it a bit better, there is 3 different bandwidths used to identify frequent flyers. There is 365 days, 60 days, and 14 days. If an individual had 2 or more peace officer custody arrests within one of these time periods, they were determined to be a frequent flyer. So nearly half of all peace officer custody arrests in the 6 years had a repeat offender within 60 days of the first one. Over a quarter repeated within 14 days. 93 individuals who accounted for multiple peace officer custody arrests within 365 days accounted for almost 285 peace officer custody arrests altogether. 38 individuals who were identified to repeat within 2 weeks accounted for 140 peace officer custody arrests. So one step that we can take to prevent this is a collaboration between law enforcement and mental health facilities. So the purpose would be able to inform and facilitate possible interventions. So what it would look like for the police department, it would provide training, have regular meetings, and have formalized information sharing system. And then, so a limitation of dealing with people that suffer from mental health illnesses is HIPAA. So it's hard when you can't disclose anyone's medical information. It makes it hard for someone who is suffering to get the help they need, especially if you wanted to call in for a friend or someone. And then limitations based on this study is that this was only conducted in one county in Oregon. There wasn't solid data on repeat informal contacts, so this throws off the numbers a little bit. This does not show individuals' experience with other parts of the criminal justice system. It only shows it with the police department. It doesn't show like the courts or anything. And then the long spells of no interaction could be due to incarceration. There's no way to telling why there was that long spell, as whether like they were just not having contact with police or they could be detained and be incarcerated. And then the last limitation is that like the time of responding to these calls is very expensive. Okay, so then the next article is, should repeat offenders be punished more severely for their crimes? So there has been a debate that sparked this research. So there's 2 different viewpoints based on repeat offenders. The first being repeat offenders convicted for the same offense should have similar consequences, and then the second being that repeat offenders should be convicted more harshly. So this study looks at whether the investigation of the prior criminal record weighs in on the sentencing and if it affects the likelihood to reoffend. So the data is drawn from state court processing data set, focusing on felony charges within the 39 most populated counties in the United States. This data was from 2009. And so this data is drawn from May prosecutions that happened on even numbered years. Each felony is followed from the court sentencing date to either the final disposition of the case or 1 year since the filing of the case. Other information that is collected in this data set is arrest charges, demographics, criminal history, pretrial detention, adjudication, and sentencing outcome. So the dependent variable in this study was repeat offending probability, and then they also had contextual variables, which was unemployment rate, population density, African American population percent, and community disadvantages. And then they also had their own community disadvantage composite variable, which was households headed by a single female mother, percent of populations that did not graduate high school, households with public assistance income, and then families below the poverty rate. So this study used a penalized quasi-likelihood procedure. So the study had micro-level findings and macro-level findings. So the micro-level findings was first-time offenders were more likely to be charged for violent or property crimes compared to repeat offenders. African-American offender is more likely compared to a white offender to have a criminal record from the past. Repeat offenders are usually male and older, and then ethnicity does not contribute to repeat offender rates. And then the macro level findings were repeat offender rate is higher when the unemployment rate is higher. This is due to individuals with a criminal record having a hard time finding a job because you have to state on your application whether you've been convicted or not. So instead of finding a solid and stable job, they will take part in crime. So then this also sparked why ban the box law came into question. So ban the box law is a fight to remove the conviction question from application so it'll be easier for prior convicted offenders to find a job. And then two other findings was when African American population rate rises in a county, repeat offending rate goes down. And as the African American population goes up in a county, first time offending rate goes up as well. So results from the question of whether you should punish repeat offenders more harshly or should they get the same punishment for the crime as a first-time offender states that from 39 counties in question, repeat offender rates are not lower in counties that punish repeat offenders more harshly. And then 3 limitations from this article is that it cannot conclude that repeat offending influences other repeat offending. Other alternative explanations were not used in this study. And the study was in urban areas of the county, meaning that it could be different results in rural areas in the county. And then my last article is a model of optimal fines for repeat offenders. So this article focuses on fines as an implementation to reduce repeat offending. This model puts in fines in which individuals can commit up to 2 offenses. The second offense is able to be a different fine than the first. The idea that is being analyzed is brought through 4 different methods. The first being it may be beneficial to fine the repeat offender more severely than the first-time offender. The second case being it may be optimal to have a less severe penalty for repeat offenders, and then the last 2, the penalties don't change. So the United States criminal justice system policy that is most commonly known is that repeat offenders are punished more harshly, and that the prior criminal record is relevant to the sentencing purpose. The model here is that offenders are allowed to commit 2 crimes and are subjected to a fine when caught. The fine for the second crime is allowed to differ from the first, and the first fine is supposed to impose as a deterrent to committing a second crime. So some arguments that were just stated in this article is like, if the second offense brings the same harm as the first offense did, why should the fine change? The fine should be uniform if the same harm was caused. If an offender has illicit gain from the offense, say he enjoyed the harm that was inflicted, why should the fine stay the same? If it stays the same, the offender won't be deterred from doing it again because the punishment's not getting worse and he obviously enjoyed it. It's hard to determine offense propensities. If the first offense was already quite harmful, if the second offense fine doesn't change, what would deter them from committing an even more harmful one the second time? A higher penalty is required in this case. So the best outcome for choosing uniform fines, individuals with low acceptable gain would be deterred, but would not deter individuals with higher acceptable gain. If uniform fine policy is used, individuals will more likely have high illicit gain, meaning high crime is already present in the first crime. So based on the exclusion of socially acceptable gains for offenses, individuals will only differ if their socially acceptable gain, if the penalty is based on the harm caused, so the level of offense, and if the punishment doesn't change, they will keep repeat offending, if that makes sense. So those are my articles that I'm presenting on this week. I'll upload this to Blackboard, and then I'll start my 2 threads for my questions. Thanks.